Hello everyone, I am the developer of Shrieking. I am going to be showing you today the new automated testing system that allows the game to essentially play itself using pre-made, recorded in-editor animations that still allows the player controller to interact with the game itself as if the player was actually playing the game. There is a command line argument coming in the newest bit of the game which allows you to use the command test and then followed by the speed of the animation speed for the test, which essentially determines how long the test will take. And this will be in version 1.5.3 of the game. And I'm going to shut up and actually play it so you can see what I am talking about, but I will give you live narration of what is happening on screen at all times. Game just takes a second here. Displays the normal startup warning signs and text. But then, once it detects that we're running a test, it skips straight to 01, scene 01, starts loading the assets.
Situated in southwest Eastland.
Sorry, I forgot to do that. So the game does all of its normal animations so that you can actually physically observe all the animations are running correctly.
It looks like I'm finally here. I think that the house is just up ahead.
However, there are a few caveats to what happens during testing mode, which I'll explain soon. So here we are in testing mode, and I am not touching the keyboard right now. So the game is currently playing itself. Now, some of the caveats I was explaining previously is that the trigger system, the game trigger system, event trigger system, how you want to sort of pronounce it, essentially works in this kind of demo mode when testing system is active. The triggers don't actually physically activate the target game object. However, the event is still logged in the game log, the log, and essentially we can record all outputs even though we are not physically activating the trigger itself and calling the relevant object. But as you can see, player movement in terms of animations is disabled because the animation controller doesn't know the player is actually walking, which means that we don't get any sort of bumpiness when we're playing. The only sort of movement we actually see is the physical input recorded from the player input. And the post effects volumes, which we'll see in a second here, are manually called instead rather than via triggers. As I explained before, the triggers are disabled. All enemies are still technically enabled, however, they cannot attack the player. The player is also basically invincible, it cannot die because
Well, at least I've found my way in. I wonder
death
what
method
dark secrets this place
is
holds.
essentially disabled when testing mode is enabled. And the player also has something like 99,000 health when in testing mode, so the player really cannot die regardless, and the on-screen damage indicator or overlay is also essentially disabled because of the high health value. And all doors do not work because Essentially, the animation passes right through them because there's no collision when the animation's enabled. Technically, there is collision enabled, but we just can't see it because the actual animation essentially moves through the collision boxes without actually being technically detected or what's the term? Visualized, I guess, because technically it's detected. But as you can see, we're able to sort of move around here. But if I try and move my mouse, which I'll try and do here, the game pulls me right back, and I cannot actually move anything on my own free will because the animation overrides any kind of input. All of the input systems are still technically active. None of them get disabled during the test. This is also to help test raycasting on objects and items to ensure that they are still working as intended. Obviously, what's the point in having an automated testing system if you can't test a system just supposed to be, actually testing? And all the post-volume effects also need to be enabled for that reason as well. And all death animations, etc., next
Oh
scene
man,
animations
is this gas?
are manually cooled.
I don't feel too good. I'm going to.
You'll also notice some of the audio effects are not enabled because of the way that the game works when it sort of uses the trigger animations, trigger body animations. So the loading screens are unchanged, but once the next scene loads, it should still play as normal.
What am I supposed to do now?
As you can see, the fade-in overlay is still active and takes a little while because the animation speed is unaffected by the player animation speed, and essentially that is completely unrelated. I can actually open up the game log in real time and monitor what is going on if I wanted to, but for the sake of just this video, I won't do that right now. And as you can see, the mouse is moving very quickly here. It even goes into a few little separate areas to make sure there's no issues with collision. Although the collision really wouldn't necessarily be noticed, it's just to detect any weird sort of teleportation or shaking, essentially, is what we're looking for. And we can pass right through these triggers because they know we're in testing mode. Theoretically, we could have picked that gun up if we moved slightly closer right there. It's also worth noting that many of the animations being used right now to test the game are not perfect. They've only really been recorded once because I've played this game potentially hundreds of times at this point through testing, and now I don't have to ever play it again, which is also a reason why there were so many bugs in the game, is simply because I really didn't want to play the game every time I made a new update for the game. So now I can just simply load this up, turn on OBS, record the game, and literally just leave it to play itself. And I just read the log file. And assuming that all of my, I can add a few more tests in, of course, and assuming everything is as to be expected, we can simply publish the release, and that is what I'm looking for. It's quite funny what the fast animation controller does to the enemies. It kind of sends them flying because the rigid body mass is technically lower than the player rigid body mass. So cutscene animations still work. Good.
Tell me something. Do you ever stop and think about all the mistakes you've made?
But it allows us to make sure we can consistently test more bugs, uh, whereas some of them would normally be missed out because we simply couldn't be bothered to play to that part of the game during an update. Because it actually takes a considerable amount of effort to play through the entire game every time you want to push a tiny little update.
Did I pass out? Where am I?
Because one playthrough can take easily an hour. and that's just Chapter 1. There is currently no automated testing for Chapter 2 because of how new it is. However, the Chapter 1 is completely automated tested apart from one singular scene because it's a duplicate of another scene with a few minor changes, but I thought wasn't necessary to actually test. All proximity mines and explosives are disabled when in testing mode. As you saw there, we were able to walk right over that proximity mine without it exploding. It should still technically be triggered though, which we will be able to view in the game log. One thing I haven't considered is if the player was to actually, well, if the developer was to actually interact with the testing system whilst it was running this test right now and say click on the terminal when the player is moving around, it would technically be okay, but it wouldn't activate the game object at the end of the test and then move on to the next level, which is like a really minor bug. However, it's still something I could probably fix. For example, in this scene here, we just saw the floor was concrete instead of wood. That's something I kept forgetting about because I simply got to this part of the game, forgot about it after my first playthrough, and then come back around again to update it. Mostly, these automated tests are visuals. And even
I can't control my arm. What is happening to me?
I don't know, Carl, what is happening to you? You're being controlled by a robot.
What do they want from me?
Also, testing things like mazes during automated testing is going to be a massive win as opposed to manual testing, because nobody enjoys testing mazes. Let me tell you right now. The amount of times that I've seen these corridors, the amount of times I've seen this floor, these enemies, etc., you would not believe. I wished I'd have made this much sooner, but it's been a big, big task. It's taken me 2 solid days of work to do. But considering this game has been in development now for many years, I should probably have implemented it when I first started, because I would have saved probably hundreds of hours of my life, according to Steam logs, and then forgetting the additional hours that were not on Steam. So probably close to 500-ish hours of strict testing for this game. And even still, I don't really know why there's still bugs. I guess you'll never fix everything. And I'm pretty aware of what the biggest bugs are. However, a lot of them are quite difficult to fix. So, yes. And it also doesn't help that this code base is now aging. I have attempted to refactor the code base on several occasions in the past. However, the code is just so bad at this point in some areas where I just give up because the new game is going to have much better code. And I don't want to.
Was it all just a dream?
Potentially.
There's no way that's possible.
Hundreds of hours refactoring my old code in a game that barely anyone plays anymore. So I'd like to imagine, as long as I can get the game to a state where I'm happy with it, which I'm pretty much there now with the release of this update, then I feel like I don't need to spend too much more time updating it anymore. see how that collision was kind of off. It was something I was aware of, but I didn't know it could actually happen like that in this scene. So I'm just learning new things right now, and this is kind of proving the whole point of this system in action. And whereas some of the interactions with the doors is obviously not realistic, the door system is incredibly well tested at this point. So I feel it mostly necessary to. One problem we do have quite consistently is the raycast system that wasn't as expected. However, there have been several changes to that over the years. God, that's actually quite loud. Let me adjust the volume a little bit so that I'm a little bit louder than the game. So the raycast system has been updated on several occasions. However, there's still issues with it, and this new automated testing system allows me to test the raycasting system much more reliably, because whenever the player controller moves around, we highlight objects, etc., and we can see more accurately and realistically how the player actually realistically interacts with these items in the scene, as opposed to just testing it behind code or just very briefly in the editor. We can also see how animations or other objects or entities in the game, such as enemies, interact with the player more realistically, and how the colliders interact with the player. But once again, it is primarily for visual effects. It also enables AI behaviors to be tested, whereas before, enemy AI behavior was never really tested in the game. But I would still like to have a more robust way of testing the enemy AI. Moving on to the lab area, getting closer towards the end of the test, and we're currently 17 minutes in. The game really has come a long way since it started. Whenever you think a game is done, it just never is. And more bugs will always come your way when you implement new features. And that is basically the entirety of the game.
Intruder detected. Initializing anti-threat system.
As you can see here, because we triggered the animation outside of the trigger zone, we didn't see that happen properly. Also, it enables us to ensure that post effect shaders are working effectively. I have seen now in a couple of places that the glitch effect is not working in a couple of animations where it really should be, and I'm completely confused why that's now happening in some parts of the game when it never used to happen at all, and it only seems to work in some parts of the game and not others for no apparent reason. These are the kind of problems I face as a single game developer on a game that is now almost, I believe, is it 6 or 7 years old or something? It's quite an old game. So there's just problems with newer versions of Unity coming out and then upgrading and then having older libraries or assets that essentially aren't compatible with the new version of Unity and then manually having to update them or port them, or actually updating them to the newer version can create other problems as well. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing so in some situations. So yes, it can be quite a dangerous time to be updating your assets when your game is being played potentially by thousands of people. And let's just say, in my own personal experience, some of my games are getting a pretty good traction in the past, and have had very subpar reviews simply because I didn't have testing systems implemented, I didn't have quality assurance of any kind, e.g. anyone playing my game before it was released or updated, and those are lessons I had to learn the hard way. And I'm finally now taking these steps to ensure I'm dedicating way more of my effort into my next game into ensuring quality assurance for the player. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg for a new automated testing system, because this only really demonstrates a few key aspects of the game. It doesn't test all of the core systems, and that is something I would like to see in my next project to be tested entirely. Perhaps instead of this system, it might be an input system instead, an input key detection system that automatically plays the keys at the relevant time frames. But that would be a lot more data processing than animation keyframes, so how to load and optimize that data is going to be a big question if I decide to go down that route, if I do decide to. And a game like this, with its aging code base, aging assets, and aging pretty much everything, you really are quite limited as to what you can do, especially with the poorly refactored code in some situations. It just does not run very well, to be honest. Um, but primarily it's just Unity updates that breaks everything half the time. So yeah, thanks Unity, but it is a good game. Sorry, good game engine. Maybe it's a good game. So we've reached the end. It is actually quite worth noting that I'd rarely ever see the end of the game after publishing an update. If I am being completely honest with you. So anyway, we can get the game.log file open here, and we can see all of the triggers that have been activated at what timestamp. And of course, I'd like to add more to this for when we're running a test. But some of these values are actually overwritten when we're running a test explicitly. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thank you for watching.